Story 1. Back in the lean years of the early 1930s, my great-grandfather used to stalk swamp beasts through the tangled waterways of Briarfen, a sleepy, hard-scrabbled town nestled near the winding claws of the Selvora River. Times were rough even, before the economy crumbled, but once the stock market tumbled and the banks buckled, desperation took root like moss on a cypress tree. My great-grandpa, along with his 4 siblings, came up in a world where every meal was earned with sweat and scraped from the wilderness. Folks tried their luck netting shrimp or casting lines for fish, but with money tighter than a rusted jar lid, nobody was buying shellfish or fresh catches. The tin-packed stuff, sardines, oysters, herring, still had a market, but the factories, packing those tins only needed so many hands. Logging jobs dried up too. With nobody building, there was no call for lumber. The sawmills whined less and less. That left honest, dirt-poor men like my grandfather with little left but to hustle however they could. Some brewed corn liquor in hidden stills, but prohibition hadn't lifted yet, and that racket was every bit as risky as it was profitable. The government men would come sniffing, and if they didn't catch you, a rival moonshiner might. There were no friendly handshakes when it came to bootleg spirits, just lead and bad blood. Still, for those daring enough, or dumb enough, there was one more path to survival, one that filled bellies and lined pockets in equal measure. Swamp lizard trapping. And I'm not talking about lizards you catch by hand. I mean the true kings of the mud, alligators. The marshes beyond Briarfen were a sprawl of flooded forest, bald cypress and swamp oak rising like sentinels from the muck. Narrow sloughs wound. Between scattered knolls the locals called float islands, patches of high ground that offered refuge from the sucking black mire. In these murky veins, gators lurked, ambush predators cloaked in shadow, thriving in the shade-choked backwaters, where the sun barely kissed the ground. With enough catfish and swamp pigs to feed on, a gator could bulk up from a scrawny hatchling to a wall-sized monster in half a decade. 12 feet of armor, muscle, and hunger. By then, they weren't just dangerous. They were nightmares. If you were going to survive the hunt, you had to know the swamp like your own soul. The best trappers memorized the nests, basking spots, and flood routes like scripture. Some made good money just leading hunters into the deepest green where the giants laid low. A good day meant 3 or 4 gators down, hides peeled and salted, and meat slung over the side of the boat. A seasoned crew of 5 could haul back enough meat and leather to feed their kin for a week, and it wasn't just the meat or the skin that held value. One old root woman who lived out past Hollow Point, folks said she was a conjure woman, a spirit talker, would buy up gator teeth and claws for her spell work. Said they made charms that could keep a man safe or damn him, depending on how they were used. So it wasn't hard to see why the trade drew greenhorns and thrill-seekers alike, especially when every other way of making an honest living had sunk into the mud. But those swamps? They didn't suffer fools. Dozens of would-be hunters vanished in that first desperate year after the crash. Some walked into the trees and never walked back out. The safest, if you could call it that, way to land a gator was with a trap. You'd hang a rancid hunk of possum or raccoon on a steel hook from an overhanging limb, just low enough to tempt a snap. Sometimes it worked. Other times the gator would lunge, snatch the bait without snagging the hook, and disappear with a splash. Leg-hold traps were more effective, but too costly for most. So the braver, or more foolish, just waded into the muck with a shotgun and a prayer. Some didn't come back. Others paddled out under moonlight in narrow skiffs called flat runners, holding oil lanterns aloft to spot the telltale glimmer of gator eyes. It made finding them easier, but with all the splashing and the stink of blood, it wasn't long before the tables turned, and the hunters became the hunted. One wrong turn, one furious old gator, and a man could vanish beneath the surface before his friends could even shout his name. Great-grandpa told a tale of one such soul, a man who limped back into town alone after a gator busted up his boat and swallowed his companions. The survivor sloshed through ankle-deep swamp water for half a night to reach the road. They found him the next day, feverish and weak, leg wound turned septic. No one could save him. Not the doctor they brought down from Belloon, not even prayers. He died within the week, and at his funeral, they lowered 3 empty coffins. Beside him, one for each of his missing friends. But even those grim stories didn't slow the tide. People kept hunting. Desperation is louder than fear. Eventually, folks began earning coin not from trapping gators, but from scavenging the gear of the ones who didn't return. A flat runner found drifting. A soggy coat caught on a root. Those told stories all on their own. The sheriff, finally, had enough. He cracked down, hard. No license, no hunting. The fine was steep. The wait to get a license even longer. But none of that stopped the desperate from venturing out. My great-grandpa was one of the lucky few with a license. So were his friends, Cormac and Waylon. While there was competition among the licensed hunters, they were mostly civil. They'd gather at a hidden watering hole deep in the woods, a place known only as the Smoky Lizard. Not its real name, mind you, just a common code folks used for illegal drink spots back then. Legend has it, you paid to see the Smoky Lizard, but all you really bought was bootleg hooch. At the Smoky Lizard, they didn't just drink and swap tales, they traded secrets. Best bait, gator trails, whispered rumors. It was there, in the muggy summer of 31, that Grandpa heard the strangest story of all. It was a sweltering night, one where the air clung to your skin like wet wool, and the only relief came from the cold bite of contraband gin at the Smoky Lizard. Great-grandpa and his 2 hunting partners, Cormac and Waylon, were sharing a plate of charred gator meat and swapping lies with the regulars when the door banged open, and in strode a man with a story that sucked the air clean out of the room. They called him Beau de Laurent, big man, barrel-chested, with a bristle of a beard and the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. Beau led a crew of 4 hardened trappers who made their living in the deepest reaches of Hollifen Swamp, way past the place even mapmakers forgot. That night, Beau wasn't just into brag or bluster. He had something to say, and everyone listened. He and his boys, he claimed, had seen something out in the thickets near Deadroot Channel. Something massive, something unnatural, a gator as white as sun-bleached bone. They'd been paddling near an old hammock when they spotted it sprawled across a low ridge, sunning itself in the open, this monstrous white gator with eyes like flickering coals. Beau swore on his mamas, grave that it stretched at least 20 feet from snout to tail, and by his reckoning, weighed close to a ton. The damn thing barely moved, just stared, watching them as if it understood what they were. Said they were lucky their boats were already piled high with gators that morning, else they might have been dumb enough to try and take it down. Instead, the creature turned, slipped into the water without a sound, and vanished. 3 other men confirmed the tale, and while no one dared call Beau a liar outright, you could taste the skepticism in the air. Still, Beau wasn't bothered. He promised those laughing behind their cups would choke on their grins when he and his crew brought Palajaw back and sold the hide for a small fortune. An albino that size? He could feed 3 families for a month just off the leather. So, night after night, Bo and his boys went out hunting the ghost of the swamp. Then, one morning, Bo's wife woke to find an empty bed and no sign of his return. It wasn't unusual for trappers to sleep out in the wild, especially if rain's trapped them or tides shifted. But when the sun dipped and still no sign of Bo or his crew, worry started settling like fog. That night, she stormed into the Smoky Lizard, tears in her eyes, rage in her voice. "What kind of hunters are you?" she demanded. "You let your own die out there?" The sheriff was already organizing a search, but his men didn't know the swamp like my great-grandpa did. If Bo was alive, wounded, stranded, circled by beasts, it would be up to the swamp folk to bring him back. Grandpa said those words hit him like a nail through the boot. He thought about bleeding out in the mud while no one came, how he'd pray for someone, anyone, to paddle through that dark and drag him home. He met up with Cormac and Waylon the next day and laid out his plan. A search party, deeper than they'd ever dared go, not just to track gators, but to find Bo Delaurent and his missing men. But, to do it right, they'd need more men and more supplies. Grandpa went around town asking other hunters to join. Most thought he'd lost his mind. No one asked Bo to chase fairy tales, they said. If he got himself eaten chasing ghost gators, that's on him. One old-timer even muttered, "He flew too close to the sun and now he's ash." Even Grandpa had to admit they weren't wrong. But something inside kept urging him forward. He said it felt like God was whispering through the trees, pushing him toward the bayou. And just when it seemed he'd go alone, a second party stepped forward. Gareth Mudfoot Dupree, known as the best gator hunter in the parish, agreed to go. Grandpa figured it was less about duty and more about Mudfoot's infatuation with Bo's sister-in-law, a girl named Sella May, but motives didn't matter. They had a team, 7 men, 2 boats, 1 plan. They pushed off the next morning, skimming down the inky waters of Deadroot Channel toward the maw of Hollow Fen. Grandpa said that whole first day felt cursed. The swamp was too quiet, the birds too still. Even the bugs seemed muted, like the whole place was holding its breath. They saw no sign of Bo or his crew, no overturned skiffs, no blood on the banks, just trees leaning like watchmen and shadows dancing across the surface. They paddled until dusk, then deeper still by lantern light. It was near midnight when they saw it, a faint glow through the trees. At first they thought it might be Mudfoot's camp, but as they drew closer, they realized the light came from stained glass and candle glow. There, perched on an island barely the size of a barn, was an old church. Peeling paint. Warped wood. A whitewashed cross slanted against its steeple. It looked abandoned, until a door creaked open and an old man stepped into the flicker light. Said his name was Deacon Jasper, half blind and half mad, but kind enough. Invited them to rest in the pews for the night, told them the spirits wouldn't mind. They tied up their skiffs and stepped inside, 4 wooden pews, a cracked crucifix, the kind of silence that clung to your shoulders. They told the deacon what they were doing, hunting for Bo and maybe for the pale monster he claimed to see. At the mention of the white gator, Jasper froze. His clouded eyes grew sharp. "I've seen it," he whispered. "Ain't no tale. It's real. Bigger than any beast that's ever crawled up from hell. And it knows." He told them how, weeks earlier, he'd been paddling near the edge of Sable Creek when something white slithered into the water behind him. It moved too fast, too silent. He could hear it breathing, following. He recited Psalm 23 as he paddled, voice shaking. And just as he said, He leadeth me beside still waters." The creature stopped chasing. Vanished. Grandpa's buddy Waylon joked that prayer wouldn't bring down something that big, but Jasper just stared at them hard. "That thing ain't just gator," he said. "It's got a taste for men, and a memory too." He warned them, not in anger, but as a man who knew the swamp's secrets too well. "You hunt it, it'll hunt you back. You kill it, and it'll curse you with its dying breath." But the next morning, they didn't turn back. They went deeper, the first blush of dawn, when the sky turned murky gold and the fog hung low over the water like the breath of sleeping giants. Great-grandpa and his crew pushed off from the church island. The deacon's warning clung to them like the swamp. Missed, but none of them spoke of it. Men who work the mire don't scare easy, but they know when they're being watched. Breakfast was a bite of dry cornbread and molasses, washed down with stale rainwater caught in a boot. They paddled in silence, every splash of the oar sounding like a hammer strike in that dead, listening quiet. The insects were loud, sure, but there was something off in the rhythm, like the swamp was unsettled. Then came the first crack, a rifle shot, distant but unmistakable. It echoed like a whip. Through the mangroves, everyone in the boat froze. A moment later, more gunshots followed. Not the deliberate crack of hunters dispatching gators, but panicked, frantic pops, the kind a man makes when he's praying his bullets keep the monsters away. They turned the boats toward the sound. The deeper they went, the darker the water grew, the thicker the vines. The gators here didn't spook. They just floated like sunken logs, black eyes glinting, massive tails curling through the silt. One of them was longer than their boat and didn't budge when they passed. They didn't stop to admire it. An hour later, the water opened to a narrow clearing, and there they saw it. A massacre. Gareth Mudfoot Dupree's camp had been torn apart. Gear scattered, boats half submerged. The bank was a butcher's slab. Limbs lay in the mud, twisted and gnawed. A torso bobbed gently in the reeds. One man's boot sat upright, still laced, like the foot had been yanked clean out of it. Grandpa said it wasn't just violent, it was angry. No bear or gator did that out of hunger. Something had hated them. They didn't even need to speak. They knew what had done it. Some wanted to turn back. And maybe they should have. Mudfoot's crew were the best hunters in 3 parishes, and they'd been slaughtered, but they didn't. Not long after leaving the carnage behind, Waylon pointed toward a rise in the reeds, a gator sunning itself on a float island, easily 12 feet long. "That's the one," Waylon muttered, finger tight around his trigger. "No," said Cormac, "that's not big enough." And then the swamp exploded. The still water in front of the basking gator erupted in a geyser of foam and blood as something pale and immense burst from below. The white beast clamped its jaws around the resting gator's skull and crunched. Bone shattered. Flesh split. The smaller gator thrashed, tail beating the water, but it didn't stand a chance. The white one, Pallid Jaw, dragged it under in a swirl of crimson bubbles and vanished. Cormac's paddle stilled mid-air. Grandpa didn't breathe. Even Waylon, who'd spent his life gutting monsters, just stared, mouth open, as the water settled once more. But silence didn't last. A moment later, the water in the narrow channel ahead began to churn, slow and deliberate as though the swamp itself were flexing its muscles. Then came the sound, a hiss like steam, a low, guttural rumble, and the white blur surged again, cutting straight toward their boat. "Row!" Grandpa shouted, snapping out of his stupor. Waylon fumbled with, the shotgun jamming shells into the breech as Grandpa and Cormac paddled like mad. The boat jumped forward with every stroke, but the thing behind them was faster. Just as the pale hide rose beneath the water's surface, glistening and vast, Waylon turned, aimed, and fired. The boom rolled across the swamp, and the pellets struck, true, shredding across Palajaw's snout. Blood sprayed, bright and alien against that pale flesh. But it only stunned him. The beast slipped beneath the water with a hiss like boiling oil. They thought they'd escaped. They were wrong. Seconds later, the channel behind them churned again, twice as fast, twice as loud, and Grandpa screamed for them to row harder. His arms felt like lead, but fear lit a fire in him no fatigue could smother. Cormac grunted with effort, the boat slicing through the murky water. Waylon, shotgun trembling in his grip, began to pray. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The water exploded again. Palajaw rose with a fury, jaws wide as a barn door, teeth flashing like daggers forged in bone. The white monster lunged, snapping just inches from the boat. Waylon fired. The blast echoed like thunder, and Palajaw howled, a deep, grating moan that didn't sound like it came from an animal. The shot tore into the side of its skull. Blood gushed. The monster thrashed, water and gore whipping in every direction. Then, with a final bellow, it sank. Disappeared. Stillness. Only the creak of their boat and their ragged breathing remained. They didn't speak as they paddled toward home. The sun was low when they reached the edge of town. Waylon's hands never left the shotgun. Cormac's eyes never lifted from the water. Grandpa's arms moved on instinct alone. Story 2. It was January of 1999 when two brothers, Caleb and Jonah Marks, ventured into the twisted wilderness of Stonewater Swamp, a massive stretch of pine flats, bog channels, and flooded cypress groves tucked deep in South Florida's backcountry. They weren't rookies. These boys had grown up chasing wild game through the marsh, but no amount of experience could have prepared them for the 6-day nightmare that would follow. Armed with rifles and an old ATV, they set off in the early morning with a plan as simple as any they'd done before. Track deer through the pine shadows, bag small game for dinner, and be back by sundown. But nature doesn't care about plans. Deep into the wetland maze, miles from the last gravel road, their ATV let out a sickening sputter and died in the mud. Just like that, they were stranded in the middle of a waterlogged jungle with no cell signal and no clear way home. At first, Caleb, the older of the two, suggested waiting. Maybe someone would notice they were gone. But they'd told no one their exact route. They could be anywhere in hundreds of square miles of thick, unmapped swamp. The brothers looked at each other, nodded without a word, and made a decision that would define the next 6 days of their lives. They left the ATV behind and set out on foot. Heavy rains from the previous week had turned the entire swamp into a shifting, flooded puzzle. Landmarks were gone. Familiar trails now ended in waist-deep mud. Even the sun seemed uncertain, casting crooked shadows through a canopy of knotted branches and Spanish moss. They tried to orient themselves using instinct, but the wilds of Stonewater don't bend to instinct. They devour it. That night, as temperatures dipped lower than usual, into the mid-40s, they huddled beneath the boughs of a cypress tree, damp and shivering. Their thin hunting jackets offered no warmth, and the only sound was the chorus of insects, the occasional splash in the water, and the low, distant bellow of a predator too close for comfort. Caleb stayed alert, hand on his rifle. Jonah, teeth chattering, whispered about hearing something close. Too close. Every crack of a twig sent a jolt through their bones. The darkness in Stonewater wasn't just black. It pressed on you like a living thing. By the second day, hunger crept in. The granola bars were gone. Their canteen was nearly empty. They drank from murky puddles, pinching their noses against the sour stink of rot. The taste was awful, but thirst was worse. They knew the risk of disease, but dehydration was a more immediate death. Mosquitoes swarmed them by the hundreds. Black clouds of them that fed relentlessly. Their arms and necks swelled with bites. The brothers sloshed through mud that clung like tar, their boots sucking at every step, legs trembling with fatigue. That afternoon, Jonah stumbled, face pale, words slurred. Caleb shook him awake and forced him to keep moving. 1 more mile, he'd say. 1 more ridge. By day 3, their steps were little more than lurches. Then, in a rare stroke of luck, they found it. An old hunter's blind half-submerged in the water. No food, no supplies. But it was something. A platform, just high enough to lift them out of the sludge. They tried to start a fire with damp twigs and the last flicker of Caleb's lighter. No luck. The storm hit that night, lightning flashing through the trees, the swamp churning in the wind. Rain fell in sheets, soaking them to the core. They clung to the blind's frame, teeth chattering, stomachs aching, praying the water wouldn't rise further. It did. By morning, they were floating again, half drowned and half delirious. The 4th day brought cold silence. Their bodies slowed. Jonah's lips turned purple. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold his rifle. He stopped responding at times, staring blankly into the trees. Caleb tied their belts together, afraid Jonah would wander off or collapse. They didn't talk about escape anymore. Survival wasn't a goal. It was a moment-to-moment act of will. Then, from nowhere, a sound, a helicopter. The brothers screamed and waved, desperate. But the swamp canopy was too dense. The sound faded. Gone. Caleb said that was the moment hope began to crack. On the 5th day, the air turned warmer, but it offered little comfort. They stumbled onto a patch of dry ground, just enough space to collapse. With trembling fingers, Caleb emptied the lighter's last fuel into a knot of dry grass. This time, a spark caught. Fire. Thin, flickering, weak, but fire. They guarded it like a newborn. That night, the firelight flickered against something watching. A pair of glowing eyes blinked in the darkness, close to the waterline. Caleb raised, his rifle, heart pounding. The eyes didn't move. He didn't fire. The thing eventually slipped beneath the surface. He didn't tell Jonah. On the morning of day 6, the smoke from their fire finally worked. Another helicopter, this one flying, lower, caught the curl of a white smoke rising through the canopy. The pilot circled, hovered. Caleb stood with arms raised high, barely able to keep them from shaking. 2 figures, skinny, mud-caked, hollow-eyed, were hoisted out of the swamp and into the sky. Back on solid ground, medics wrapped them in blankets, pumped them with fluids and took them to a hospital in Naples. The doctors called it a miracle. 6 days. No food, contaminated water, exposure, predators. They shouldn't have survived, but they did. Later, Caleb told reporters, "Every night I thought we were done. I thought we were gator bait. I could hear them out there, waiting." The Marks brothers never went back into Stonewater, but their story stayed. A haunting, mud-soaked reminder that the swamp isn't just a place. It's a test, and sometimes you don't walk out the same person who walked in. Story 3, tucked in the lowlands of southeastern Verena, where cypress trees rise like crooked teeth and fog clings to the water like secrets, there lies a place folks call Wraithpine Swamp. Ancient, brooding, and thick with decay, the swamp has always carried a strange reputation, from whispers of spirits to tales of fugitives vanishing into its vine-choked corridors. But none are more unsettling than what happened there in the autumn of 1987. The story begins with a man named Elias Boone, a respected mechanic and businessman from the nearby town of Lantern Hollow. He ran a successful auto salvage yard, kept his property neat, and was known to quote scripture like it was second nature. He was also a devoted family man, father to 6 children, and fiercely protective, particularly of his eldest daughter, Miranda. To outsiders, Elias was the picture of rural decency, but behind closed doors, things were far more fragile. His wife, Clara, often saw the cracks in his armor. There was something about his protectiveness, something just a little too intense. When she finally pressed him, Elias made a confession. His own childhood had been marred by brutal abuse. His father, a cold and violent man, had left scars deeper than flesh. Elias swore he'd never become that kind of man. But sometimes, Clara feared, the damage was already done. As Miranda grew into a fiery, independent teen, tensions mounted. She resented the restrictions Elias placed on her, dropped out of school, began sneaking out. Then, worst of all in Elias's eyes, she started seeing a man nearly twice her age, a married man. Elias confronted her, begged her to end it, to see reason. But Miranda wouldn't be controlled. She told him to butt out. That fall, everything unraveled. On the night of November 21st, Elias told police that he had driven Miranda to a nearby roadside lot to meet a man named Judd, who was selling a second-hand SUV. According to Elias, Miranda took the vehicle for a short spin, paid in cash, then asked if she could take it out alone for a while before heading home. He agreed, reluctantly. The next morning, she was gone. The SUV was gone, and no one had seen her since. Elias filed a missing persons report, and police took the case. Though, slowly, as Miranda was legally an adult. He spoke with urgency, painting a picture of a concerned father and a daughter who'd fallen into dangerous company. But the truth was buried far deeper than Elias let on. The day after Miranda vanished, a local trapper hiking near Wraithpine's outer edge stumbled across a gruesome sight. There, in the mud near the swamp's edge, lay the crumpled, naked body of a young woman. Her face had been beaten beyond recognition. Her chest was riddled with bullets. Only fingerprints identified her. It was Miranda Boone. Near her body were torn undergarments and blood-streaked brush. No signs of robbery. No signs of mercy. As the investigation turned toward Miranda's home life, disturbing signs emerged. Her younger sister, Sadie, tearfully told detectives about bloodstains she'd seen in their father's truck the same night Miranda vanished. She hadn't said a word. She was afraid of her own father. When questioned again, Elias said he'd sold the truck. Police tracked it down and conducted a forensic sweep. What they found chilled them. Miranda's hair in the trunk and traces of her blood on the back seat. That's when the story began to twist. Elias Boone vanished the same day the truck was recovered, slipped out of town with only a single bag and a 1,000-yard stare, His wife, Clara, was so disturbed by his sudden behavior and whispered confessions that she went straight to the police, convinced the man she'd married was no longer in control of himself. 2 months later, Elias was arrested across state lines in Indiana. He offered no resistance, no explanation, just a blank, eerie calm. What came next turned the case from horrifying to surreal. While in custody, Elias was evaluated by Dr. Marcus Vell, a forensic psychologist. Through hours of hypnotherapy and psychological interviews, Vell uncovered something staggering. Elias Boone wasn't one person. He was many. 10 distinct identities, he claimed, each with its own voice, mannerisms, and memories. There was Hammer, the angry protector; Mara, a quiet, grieving child; Warden, who enforced Elias's moral codes. One identity, disturbingly, even claimed to be Miranda herself. Another, called Shade, spoke of purging weakness and filth. Dr. Vell diagnosed Elias with severe dissociative identity disorder, a psyche fractured by childhood trauma, where certain personas had taken over during key moments of stress or rage. But not everyone believed him. The state brought in their own expert, a clinical psychiatrist who argued that the so-called personalities were nothing more than theater, symptoms, amplified by suggestive therapy. He accused Dr. Vell of planting ideas during hypnosis and claimed Elias's behavior was manipulative, not disordered. The trial became a battle of minds, trauma versus deception. Elias's lawyers claimed that when Miranda pulled a gun during a confrontation, one of his darker personas, possibly Shade or Hammer, took control. They argued that Elias had no conscious memory of pulling the trigger, of driving her to the swamp, of leaving her body for the vultures. The prosecution disagreed. Their case was brutally simple. Elias Boone killed his daughter in a fit of rage, beat her to make it look like a crime of passion, then tried to cover his tracks with a carefully crafted lie. They presented evidence that Elias had staged the SUV story, disposed of the weapon, and manipulated his family into silence. The jury took just under 7 hours. Guilty, Elias was sentenced to life without parole. But the story doesn't end there. In July of 1994, 7 years into his sentence, Elias Boone escaped, slipped out through a prison garbage chute with another inmate. For days, it was feared he'd been crushed to death. In truth, he'd stolen a car and driven to the coast. He didn't run for freedom. He ran to 2 graves, his mother's and Miranda's. When he was caught 4 days later, exhausted, unarmed, and strangely serene, he told the officers he only wanted to apologize. Not to the world, not to the courts, to his daughter, to the memory he couldn't bury. These swamps don't forget. Neither should you. From the haunted backwaters of Briarfen to the crushing grip of Big Cypress, and the twisted secrets buried deep in the Great Dismal Swamp, each story reveals something raw and relentless about human nature, survival, and the monsters we chase or become. Whether it's the spectral terror of a white-scaled predator, the suffocating silence of 6 days lost in the wild, or the chilling unraveling of a fractured mind. These aren't just tales. They're warnings. Listen, reflect, share. Because sometimes the real wilderness isn't out there in the dark. It's inside us.